As Fred mentioned, I'm going to talk about how accusations of apostasy or blasphemy or insulting Islam or accusations of that kind operate within the Muslim world and how they are now spreading into the Western world. And as mentioned, together with my colleague, Nina Shea, a member of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, we've just published a book of the title, Silenced: How Apostasy and Blasphemy Codes Are Choking Freedom Worldwide, not just in the Muslim world, but here. And there are copies for sale, and I will gladly sign them. I'll sign them twice if you want. So, 20 years ago, for most of us, at least most of us living outside the Muslim world, the idea of being accused of blasphemy and finding that dangerous would be unusual. There were still blasphemy laws on the books, but nobody had used them for years. It was a thing of the past. That changed in 1989, when the late Ayatollah Khomeini, then Iran's supreme leader, declared that every Muslim in the world had a duty to kill British-based writer Salman Rushdie on the grounds that his novel, The Satanic Verses, was blasphemous. Khomeini's edict triggered a wave of violence. Rushdie has survived, but only at the cost of living a hidden life. His associates were not so fortunate. The novel's Japanese translator was assassinated, its Italian translator was stabbed, its Norwegian publisher was shot, 35 guests at a Turkish hotel hosting its Turkish publisher were burnt to death. Subsequently, the 21st century has witnessed repeated eruptions of violence worldwide in reactions to, amongst many things, Dutchman Theo van Gogh and Ayaan Hirsi Ali's film Submission, or the famous Danish cartoons, or the less famous Swedish cartoons, Pope Benedict's Regensburg speech on reason and violence in religion, Geert Wilders' film Fitna, and many other matters that appear almost every week. Some events, such as the declaration by Pastor Terry Jones, a deservedly obscure Florida pastor, that he would burn a Quran, achieved a perfect media storm. It managed to draw in US military leaders in Afghanistan, cabinet ministers, and the US president. And dozens of people were killed, mainly in Nigeria. The first thing I want to say about these sort of eruptions of violence against perceived insults to Islam is that people's sense of insult is very real, but these are manipulated by governments very deliberately for specific ends. They are not simply an outburst. Let us take an example. I think you've all heard of the very famous Danish cartoons, published by the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten in September 2005. These cartoons came out early September. They were reproduced in newspapers in Egypt, in Jordan, and Yemen, apart from other places. And what happened? Nothing. No outcry, no whatever. December, I should mention those newspapers published some in order to denounce them and say they were bad, but nobody was killing anybody. Then in December of that year, the organization of the Islamic, then called Organization of Islamic Conference, now Cooperation, meeting in Saudi Arabia, its headquarters, decided to make an issue of the cartoons and demanded that its members do. So Egypt, amongst others, tried to organize a boycott of Danish products. There were distributions of flags around the world, demonstrations in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and violence, and dozens were killed. This happened in February 2006, 5 months after the cartoons came out. The violence did not erupt when the cartoons came out. It was when the OIC decided to make an issue of it. Saudi Arabia and Egypt irritated by the then US policy of pushing for democracy in the Middle East, urged boycotts of Danish products. Iran and Syria manipulated riots partly to deflect attention from their nuclear projects. Denmark was about to chair the UN Denuclearization Committee. Turkey later used the cartoons as bargaining chips to get better positions in NATO in direct negotiations with President Obama. Later, Lars Vilks' far more offensive Swedish cartoons, or Geert Wilders' film Fitna, produced hardly any reaction. And the Swedish cartoons were, unlike the Danish ones, were offensive. No response. Nobody decided to make an issue of those. So we have this coming to our attention because of what is happening in our part of the world. Let us look what such accusations do within the Muslim world itself. Islamists and authoritarian governments now routinely use accusations of apostasy, blasphemy, hurting the feelings of Muslims, insulting Islam, defamation of religion, or any of these, to repress people who turn away from Islam, or religious minorities, or dissident Muslim journalists, political dissidents, or religious reformers. To take one example, currently, millions of Baha'is and Ahmadis, who are followers of religions or interpretations that arose after Islam, are condemned en masse as de facto insulters of Islam. If you want to get a Pakistani passport, you have to fill out a form denouncing the Ahmadis. That's part of the application process. If you go to the Pakistani embassy website in Washington, D.C., you can pull down that form. In Iran, the Baha'i leadership is currently in prison, as they're believed to be insulting Islam because they have a prophet after Muhammad. There is no penalty in Iran for killing a Baha'i. You kill a Baha'i, nothing happens. They have no legal status. Those who convert from Islam to another religion faced similar fates. In Somalia, the Al-Shabaab militia is systematically hunting down and killing every Christian in the area it controls on the grounds that they were previously Muslims, they're apostates, so they must die. Or again, in 2009, after allegations that a Quran had been torn, a 1,000-strong mob rampaged through Christian neighborhoods in Punjab and Pakistan, killing 7 people, 6 of whom, including 2 children, were burnt alive. The police stood aside and did not intervene. So converts and minorities are oppressed. Another major target is Muslim reformers. You might remember now that 6 years ago, an Afghan Christian, Abdul Rahman, he was discovered by the government, put on trial for his life as an apostate. He was subsequently smuggled out of the country. At this time, a Muslim man, Ali Nasab, editor of a magazine, wrote an article saying, "Does Islam really require us to kill people who are converts?" What was the response? He was arrested for blasphemy, and he was thrown in prison. That is, you weren't even allowed to argue about the question. In Saudi Arabia, activists for democracy have been imprisoned for using what was called un-Islamic terminology, which were the terms democracy and human rights. In Bangladesh, Salahuddin Chowdhury was imprisoned for hurting Muslims' religious feelings by advocating peaceful relations between Bangladesh and Israel. In Iran, Ayatollah Barzani was imprisoned for arguing that political leadership by the clergy is contrary to Islam. He was accused again of blasphemy. This is a pious Shiite Muslim, an Ayatollah, disagreeing with the government's view of the nature of law. So these laws, these restrictions, are also used for internal repression. One shouldn't think of insult in the normal way of saying sort of bad, meant to be hurtful things, But any difference, any disagreement, any departure from the local hegemonic form of Islam gets you killed or imprisoned. One of the worrying things is that these strictures are now spreading in the West. So, for example, in Austria, Elisabeth Sabaditsch-Wolff has been convicted of denigrating religious beliefs for her comments about Muhammad. These were not comments about Muslims. This wasn't the sort of usual European hate speech laws that you were racial. Specifically comments about Muhammad. She says she's not going to pay her fine, and so will be going to prison. Thank you very much. In Canada, that country's grossly misnamed human rights commissions have interrogated writers, including a very famous one, Mark Steyn, about their writings on Islam. In Europe, popular politicians such as Geert Wilders or Jussi Halla-aho, he's in Finland, have been prosecuted again for comments made in political speeches. They're both elected representatives. Prosecuted for what they have said in political speeches about Islam. There are many hundreds more examples which could be given in Europe, including the prosecution of Muslims, especially female Muslim politicians who criticize dominant forms of Islam and the status of women in Islam. The first Muslim MP, member of parliament, in Germany has to go around with bodyguards. The first Muslim senator in Belgium, she has to go around with bodyguards. So this affects Muslim reformers as well. If we turn our attention to America, in America, the First Amendment still protects us from being prosecuted for saying negative things about Islam. But we still face two dangers. One is extra, outside the law, intimidation. The other one is the current administration's professed commitment to try and shape what we say about Islam. On the first one, intimidation. In 2009, Yale University Press, in violation of its agreement with an author, removed all illustrations of Muhammad from the scholarly book by Jette Clausen on the Danish cartoons. This was a book they published on the cartoons. They had agreed to put a one-page photograph of the newspaper page, so the cartoons would be pretty small. Yale backed out of it, including any other illustrations, including Gustave Doré's 19th century illustration of Muhammad in Hell, illustration for Dante's Inferno. They decided it was just too dangerous. Random House, major New York publisher, subsequently rejected, after agreeing to publish it, rejected the historical romance novel about Muhammad's wife Aisha to protect the safety of the author. The comedy show, South Park, refused to show an image of the Muslim prophet, even though completely covered in a bearsuit and accompanied by other religious leaders. Another case, Molly Norris, a cartoonist for the Seattle Weekly, jokingly suggested we should have an Everybody Draw Muhammad Day. To get over this thing, nobody's allowed to do it. After death threats, the FBI advised her to go into hiding. She gave up her job, changed her name, and has gone effectively into a witness protection program. This is in the United States. Just one more. On October 3rd, 2011, 800 American newspapers refused to run the Non Sequitur cartoon by Wiley Miller. The cartoon had no depiction of Muhammad. It merely showed a bucolic, nice, beautiful, peaceful scene with the caption, "Where's Muhammad?" The Washington Post and 800 other newspapers did not cover that. Many of our media claim they self-censor out of sensitivity to religious feelings, but that fatuous claim is repeatedly undercut by their willingness to mock other religions. As British comedian Ben Elton said of the BBC will make you let vicar gags, that's jokes about clergy, pass, but they won't let imam gags pass. They might pretend that it's, something to do with their moral sensibilities, but it isn't. It's because they're scared. So this pattern is starting to establish itself in the US. Then we have present government's relationship with the Organization of the Islamic Conference, an organization of 57 countries around the world committed to the propagation of Islam, which is interesting because there are only 44 majority Muslim countries in the world. But this is the OIC's mission, and a lot of the current trend begins when President Obama made his famous speech in Cairo to the Muslim world. In that speech, he said that he would, I quote, fight against negative stereotypes of Islam whenever they appear. Why a US president would assume that as a particular responsibility, he did not say. In July 2011, in a meeting with the OIC in Istanbul, Hillary Clinton invited the OIC to Washington to exchange ideas on how the US government and others could combat purported negative stereotyping of Islam. That conference was held in December of last year. That's just 2.5 months ago. This was hosted by the State Department, had other countries there, but it was co-chaired by the Organization of the Islamic Conference. Presentations focused on America's supposed deficiencies in its treatment of Muslims. They stressed, the presentations made by US officials stressed that the US needed to learn from the other delegations, including apparently Saudi Arabia, who was there despite its ban on churches, its repression of Shiites, its textbooks teaching that Jews should be killed, and the fact that, on the opening day of the conference, it beheaded a woman for sorcery. If the Obama administration is committed to defending constitutional rights, and it says we have no intention of trying to limit speech, if that is the commitment, why is it, as the OIC Secretary General says, standing united with the OIC on speech issues? In concluding, the freedom to debate or criticize religious ideas is an essential part of religious freedom. Islam shapes many of its followers in culture, politics, economics, science, educational, personal and family life, law, and society. Hence, limits on criticism about or within Islam silence criticism of dominant religious ideas and political power. In the Muslim world, these restrictions enable radicals, fundamentalists, extremists to win. In a debate between Muslims, the extremists will accuse their opponents of blaspheming Islam or insulting Islam or departing from Islam and kill them or threaten them or silence them. Usually the moderates will not do that the other way, so these laws are a chief mechanism to establish radical Islam in the Muslim world. To quote Nasser Abu Zaid, a Muslim scholar driven out of Egypt by the Islamists, he writes of this, says, these restrictions are key weapons in the fundamentalist arsenal to prevent reform of Muslim societies and confine the world's Muslim population to a bleak, colorless prison of social, cultural, and political conformity. President Obama should end US government attempts to cooperate with the OIC on issues of speech or freedom of religion, and instead make it his stance and our stance to declare that in open, boisterous, free societies, all views and all religions will be subject to credulity, to criticism, and to contradiction, and that the OIC and everybody else should learn to accept and protect this. As the late Abdullah Ram Wahid, the former president of Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim country, and head of Nahdlatul Ulama, the world's largest Muslim organization, wrote in his foreword, he wrote a foreword to this book, because he's a man committed to freedom. He writes, rather than encourage Muslim fundamentalists in their efforts to impose a spiritually void, harsh, and monolithic understanding of Islam upon the world, Western authorities should instead firmly defend freedom of expression. When politics and religion are intertwined, as they necessarily are in debates about Islam, then without religious debate and religious criticism, there can be no political debate or criticism. America's founders, at a time when religious differences were far more pervasive and dangerous than they are now, prophetically forbade laws impeding the free exercise of religion or abridging freedom of speech or the freedom of the press. Their testimony and their example is always needed, but never more so than now as we face these attempts to repress our freedom of religion and freedom of speech. Thank you very much.